Grazing. It might not be super exciting or illustrious at all, but it's important to the ranching world. So today we talk about having a plan and how to manage your grazing areas. Welcome to Hashknife Hangouts. I'm Calen. My co-host is my father, Brandon. And if you enjoy our content and our weekly discussions, then like, comment, and subscribe. Check out our other social media, Instagram, Rumble, Twitter, and Facebook. And thanks for joining us yet again for some of our returning viewers. Today, we talk about grazing. Specifically, I'm going to talk about benefits, the importance of having a grazing plan, uh, potentially mapping your different grazing systems, pasture quality and productivity, and then, of course, determining and measuring pasture quality. And then that all just goes into how do you make a ranch profitable? That joke is you don't. The real thing is, I got this all from an extension report from the University of Minnesota. It's actually very interesting. So I'm going to go through what they said in there, and we'll just discuss it one by one. But what I'll start with is some of the benefits of grazing. They talk about the cost, the marginal land usage, and then of course the environment, because that's a big part, especially these days. So when it comes to the cost, they said the biggest cost in most, if not all, of the cattle production systems is the feed, and that's absolutely accurate. We talk about hay all the time. So many of the producers use grazing to reduce costs for their operations, which also makes sense, and it helps sustain the operation overall. And in the report, they said that the properly managed pasture based systems use land efficiently and provide high production per acre, which that makes sense. We're trying to maximize the usage of each acre to the cows and the horses for us as well. But then the marginal land, not all land can grow crops, right? Which makes sense because we don't have that ability. We would be considered dry land farming if we did, and we just don't have the ability to do that, and especially with the soil that we have as well. So the pieces of land that are not able to grow crops like corn, wheat, and stuff like that are usually described as marginal. So then grazing comes in as a way to provide a crop in terms of grass on the land that's suitable for animals to forage on and to graze. So then the cows are then using that grass. They make it what would otherwise be an unproductive land plot. They make it productive by making them and their calves, as they grow up, larger and heavier and beefier to literally make them into beef later on for us to eat. Finally, the environmental part, the benefits of grazing again. It's for the land itself. Studies have shown that the benefit of grazing as a tool to conserving wildlife habitat and keeping the prairie healthy is very important. But then also incorporating cover crops into the cropping system has major benefits to land, such as like a decreased compaction and decreased soil erosion, which, especially in our country, with it being windy, that soil erosion is very important because it keeps the soil from getting blown away. And then, of course, it decreases runoff for any places that might have a lot of water. We don't know what that problem is. But then these cover crops then are used as a valuable part of the grazing rotation. And we've talked about this before, hay and Timothy grass and crested wheat, some of those different things that you can use for a product like hay can also be used as part of the grazing crop. So with that, we'll start with some of the grazing benefits, and I'll kick it over to Dad.
Well, I mean, it's the obvious thing is if you can graze it, put something down a cow's throat and they gain weight, then you're, just as you pointed out earlier, that you're making beefsteaks or hamburger or roasts eventually for the consumer. And if you can't put a plow on it, which this country it's marginal for, putting a plow on a lot of different pieces of ground, depending on where it's at. But, you know, to sit there and be idle is not productive. So, grazing is the best way. And your comment earlier also about the more you can graze, the more potential profitability that you have, or at least you don't have money into overhead to purchase feed. And that's very true. That's something that can only be done for so long, though, especially in the northern climates. I'm not sure about the southern climates. I think they've got enough, even in the wintertime, their grass growth slows, but they still have grazing ability for the most part. So they try to maximize the type of grasses that will be utilized for higher protein more punch, more weight gain on those animals, even in the cooler months. So, you run things entirely differently. And I don't know how they run it there. I've never worked a place in the South. So, of course, it depends on what part of the South. Are you on the eastern side of the U.S. or are you on the western side of the U.S. where, the desert is a kind of a tough way to make a living for anything. So, it is all about what you said, your ecosystem and weather. So, that varies from year to year, and it varies throughout the season of how your grass is and can be utilized. So, um, again, these are some of those variable type of things, and grass is variable in its content and its uh, palatability in how it will have a cow or calf gain weight. You can have some poor grass on the very same ground that the year before you had really good grass, and just depends on when the weather hits, the growth cycle, too much heat, pests, that kind of thing. You're always competing for those sorts of those things. And like right now, the year started out okay. We haven't had a lot of rain, but the rain came at just the right times. It seemed like that we could get some decent growth for a while, and then when the heat come on, then it everything just shut off. And so we're shy on grass, and it's very, very dry in this part of the country right now. So if you look on a drought map of the U.S., you'll see that, geez, even the central U.S., Texas is in really bad straits right now. The whole western side of the United States is pretty dang dry. So that doesn't bode well for a product to get to consumers in a little bit of time. And it takes a while for, to work through the food chain, just because we're raising something right now. A lot of times these animals don't get slaughtered for 36 months. So that's a long time. And that's kind of an average, but depending on where you're at. So, and it's all weight dependent. Better grass you have, the faster that animal can get to slaughter weight for the optimum, what, they like to see for getting the most meat on an animal, most weight with the lowest um, extraneous weight gain, which would be like your bone, hide, things like that. So, that skeletal structure needs to hopefully stay not as dense, and so you're getting as much weight as possible through
Yeah,
the meat and flesh.
and I'm going over a bunch of this stuff in here while you're talking, kind of like making sure that the conversation makes sense because
Yeah.
there's a lot of information. So if anybody's interested in the grazing aspect, and especially this report that I'm pulling from the University of Minnesota, I will have the link below. But there's so much good information in here. And it's just it can be overwhelming because I'm looking at all of it right now. And a lot of the stuff I have right now is I copied and pasted, and then I just formatted it so I can kind of go through the bullets. But something you brought up during your discussion right there was essentially pasture quality and determining the quality of it, right? And then that feeds into the next part, which is stocking density. How many cows can we put on the pasture? So um oh goodness, we can go over so much of that. I guess let's start with because can't put the horse before the cart or the cart before the horse. There you go. How do you measure the pasture quality and productivity? I'll tell you what the report says, and I'll get your input. And it says good pasture condition is critical for successful grazing systems. Obviously, the pasture quality may vary greatly from one pasture to another, and that is no joke. People may think it's literally just over the fence. They're not that different. Oh, but they can be, and it is crazy because it depends on how well somebody's taken care of that pasture in the past and how well you've taken care of it recently. Forage grass and legume. I said that right?
Legumes,
Legume
legumes. You always
species.
mess that up.
I know. Each have their own unique growth, persistence, and quality because they respond differently to soil conditions. Again, soil conditions can be different just based off of the side of the fence they're on, which is crazy. Weather patterns obviously can change the grasses, and then fertility and grazing management. All right, those all make sense. Evaluating the entire system is important because if you don't, then obviously you can't have success within your whole grazing plan. So then that goes into determining and measuring your quality for the pasture. And what they say at the University of Minnesota is first survey what is available. Walk through your pastures if necessary to gather the information. Thankfully, we've got a grass nerd, Braden, to look at some of that stuff and tell us the overall coverage and the density of the forage in your pastures can be rated as thin, average, or thick. A lot of times for us recently, it's been thin because of the drought, so that's pretty easy. But then if some people are evaluating the pastures every time, you can keep track of the trend. That's simple analytics. Let's make sure we're watching what we're doing. We can manage better. And then you're turning it from just what people might think of ranching as a hobby to a business. You're looking at those very specific details. And then you can identify dominant species in the pasture and use a map to kind of keep track of things. But it says for relatively small cost, a forage sample you collect can be tested by your local forage lab, which is crazy. I didn't know that. Braden
Mm.
probably knows where those are at. And then that information about protein, mineral content, and more is incredibly valuable. Which that mineral part will lead into something that we'll talk about later with supplementing the herd. So with that, I'll just start with Dad's take on some of that, the pasture quality and productivity, and determining the quality of the pastures.
Um, well, again, it starts out in the spring. How's your pasture overwintered? Have you grazed it? Because it's not always possible to have snowfall covering your ground all the time. It does some years, but a lot of years, no. It's just warming and freezing trends, and you get snow, and you'll cover it, and then it will melt off, just barely melt, but it'll clear the ground, and those cows will tend to graze. I mean, they want to graze. That's what they do, even though you supplement them with hay. So they'll get a belly full, leave the hay ground, or all the hay is gone, or because I try to figure like 30 pounds a day per head, uh, and they may or may not eat that up, but then they get a little bit bored, and instead of using that rumen system that they have, and they chew on cud, they're still wanting to put more in their mouth, so they'll go out and graze. You can overgraze your pasture in the wintertime too, even though it's frozen. It can be very, very difficult to maintain it and keep it healthy. So you've got to, to us, we rotate our feeding grounds. Basically, I rotate those all over the pasture, try to do it systematically, so then in the spring, then we can take a harrow over it, bust up any of the cow crap and any little bit residual feeds, things like that,
And
and
what you're
then
talking about
let
is
that
where
go
you
in.
lay out the hay for the
Yeah,
feeding ground, like
right.
where they'll end up congregating and collecting.
Yeah, because that's a high impact area,
Right.
and so you can you got to be careful how you do that, and I don't think we've got any lock on doing the right thing there. I mean, you're always learning. And again, conditions can change where you're not getting the bang for your buck you should, because you haven't got any rain coming. Now, some of these in our dryland areas, we really don't have a lot of control over what we do other than don't overgraze. And so, that's kind of a tough deal. We started out pretty good, as I said earlier this year, but now with the conditions that have happened, we have overgrazed, or are in the process of starting to overgraze or overstock based on conditions of the ground, because we've got less rain. So we got to move these animals around. We got to uh, even start feeding a little early, and that may be part of the case what we have to do this year,
Well,
just
and
as we did last year.
that leads to the question though, because yeah, what you're saying is, we may have to do something similar to last year or the
Mhm.
same in terms of feeding them a little earlier with hay than what we would ideally like. But how does one determine overgrazing? What are the things that you're looking at that you said, okay, this is something that clearly we are overgrazing? Because people may not realize you're checking the animals, but you're also checking the pasture when you go out every
Yeah.
day. So what are some of those telltale signs, um, some of those things that you need to keep in the forefront of your mind when you're looking at the grass and the forage when you check the animals?
Well, it's the easy part of that is, how much standing grass do you have? Do you have quite a bit of standing grass?
Hmm.
Now that can kind of fool you a little bit. You need to get out and walk through your pastures or ride through them, and be on the ground, because you can look across a pasture from a road, look through a section or a quarter section or whatever you've got, And if you got standing grass there, it looks like, oh, yeah, we got some grass, but you get out into it and stand over the top of it, and that grass is thin. So you need to evaluate, just as I think you mentioned earlier, is get out there, walk your pastures, look at what they're grazing on. They're always looking for the most palatable, best stuff that they can get, which is right at the crown of a plant. And so if they can do that, have that kind of available feed, then they're not going to eat as much of the standing old grass. They'll eat that last. So just because it looks like you got a lot of grass out there doesn't necessarily mean that you do and that's what they're eating. And if you start to break down and chew too close because they've got not enough feed, then you can start to hurt the crown of that plant. And again, this is just as you said, this is way more beneficial to have a discussion with Braden about this,
Yeah.
being our grass geek. But um, nothing is ever formally taught to me.
Yeah.
You look at it and it's kind of a common sense thing, but you gotta keep an eye on things. Look at the condition of your cows too. If you got a lot of grass out there, and I think in some areas, kind of the areas where you're at, I've heard about um, cattle, horses being belly deep in grass in Kentucky and starving to death because of protein content that
Right.
is not there. That you have too much water growing nice lush looking grass, but there's no punch in it for feed value. So the condition of your cattle tell really is the ultimate tell of what's going on. But that doesn't mean you don't have grass. You may have some extreme heat, and those
Mm.
animals don't want to eat. Like we're going through right now. Yesterday was 100 degrees,
Triple
and I
digits. Yeah.
watched those. Yeah, and those cattle in the mornings it's 60 degrees, 58 degrees in the morning, which thank goodness for us. I mean, it does cool off. I was up at 4 this morning. It was 69 degrees. By 5:30, it was down to uh, about 52. So I didn't think it was going to cool off that much in just a couple hours, but luckily it did. Cattle are out grazing. They're spread out right now. They're out, clubbing some grass and trying to make a living. And you watch them in another couple of hours, they'll come in for water and then they will just hang out. They'll lay down and try to move as little as possible because today's going to be another 95-degree day. Thank God we don't have any wind with it because, then you start to dry out body systems
Right.
and dehydrate. And the grass is the same way. What little moisture is in there will just get sucked out by the ground too. Not that we have much. I was building some fences last week and I'm going down 32 inches for planting a post and it's like powder. There's just no moisture in the ground. So that, for a post planting, for fencing, that's one thing. I mean, it's inconvenient, but you know what? If it ain't there for grass, that's a big problem. So
Right.
conditions change in that pasture over time is the big thing, and that time can be very short. That can change conditions within a month or two. So you got to have the ability to put them somewhere else or feed them, or you start getting rid of some animals.
Like you said a little bit earlier, you've never had any formal education as to taking care of land rotation like Braden does. Braden has
Mhm.
range land management degree. He understands grasses and just overall growth and he's had a lot of classes and like I said, he enjoys it, so he's a nerd about it.
Yep.
The question is, with not having a formal education like that, and most ranchers and farmers are like that, they've just kind of grown up, they've learned from the person before them, they've taken information they've learned over the years in their own regards as well. How can you, with a certainty, understand that you've overgrazed an area or you are about to overgraze an area or that a pasture just is not producing what it is? You've already said the animal
Mhm.
condition that helps a lot, of course, because you're seeing the end result. Okay, are they gaining weight, losing weight? Are they maintaining? That's kind of an easy telltale sign. But what other things are you looking for other than, like you said, thin grass versus animal condition? What are some of those things that you're seeing when you're going out there and you're going, okay, clearly to me it is XYZ.
All right. Well, it's looking at your soil condition too. It isn't just your grass condition; it's your soils. That's what I was kind of alluding to with
Uh,
the moisture content in it. But are these animals hitting this ground over and over again, trying to find the same grass that they just ate because there's nothing there? I mean, that's pretty obvious.
Hmm.
You start looking for other things, and this is where I was going to lead into next. So it kind of worked out is what other things are growing there? Are you starting to see some weeds? Are you starting to see some kind of encroaching type of plants that are not palatable, but they are indicators of a stressed ground? For instance, in this country, in the last decade or so, we've really seen a lot more of the broom snakeweed, which is kind of like a rubber rabbit is the name of it in the like on the coastal areas. That kind of a plant that's got really no value to it, but it does show the ground being stressed. Now, doesn't necessarily mean it's overgrazed because I've seen some ground that has zero grazing on it, yet it's got some of this broom snakeweed on it. So you got to look at that and go, okay, what's causing it? And some of it, with our movement of hay across our nation, we're introducing species of grasses that shouldn't be introduced, and that can be a problem as well. So that it isn't necessarily that the grazing caused it. What we're sticking out there to feed that animal can drop seeds and plants, and they can establish and take off. So you have to look at what you're doing for sustainability. I mean, you just can't overgraze and hope that next year we'll have some good rains and good grass, and pasture is going to come right back to the way it was. You're changing it all the time. So your question about how do you know? Well, I always self-doubt. You always hope you're doing the right thing, and try to guard against the obvious, and look for worst case scenario. Where are we headed with this? We need to change it. And I talked to Braden about it, and he goes, "Oh no, you're fine. It's looking good out there." I still have that self-doubt because I don't want to cause problems that we don't
Right.
we don't need. So uh, I still think right now in the last 2 weeks, you can really see a change in the ground. You can see a change in the cattle. So I'm gonna, as soon as we start getting some feed in, I'm gonna have to start supplementing, I think, because a lot of these cows got calves on them. I don't want to dump them if we can help it. If we have to, we do, but it isn't because it's convenient. It's because we're trying to save that ground and that grass um, for later, for 5 years from now. You could put something on, make it look like a feed lot. What good is it going to do you? You're going to have nothing but weeds come up, and
Right.
some of these areas that we do have some improved grass. Grandpa's planted some crested wheat into some of this ground after they had farmed it really early on in the teens of our 20th century, and this was great fertile ground, never been used before, and they were getting some pretty good stands of wheat off this, and they still do in the areas, but they're fertilizing now. Never used to do that, and that's one thing that we really can't do on dryland grass. You fertilize at the wrong time. I don't think you're not going to get your money's worth out of it. Plus, you
Right.
may burn that grass and do more harm than good if you don't get any water on it. If you have an irrigated or sub-irrigated type of pasture, yeah, you can do some of that and probably get away with it and be okay, particularly if you're growing hay on it. But um, those areas have, I think, less variability in the type of grass because the water's available. The conditions don't change that much, where your root systems can grow because of sub irrigation or irrigation that you're putting on the top side. So completely different types of grasses, pastures, what they'll take, what they'll thrive with, and you can't put Timothy out on our, which is a great grass. God, I wish we had tons of Timothy, but you have to have the moisture with it as well, and be able to grow it. So orchard grass the same way. Those are really good grasses, but they take a lot of good water, and you don't have that on a dry land. So it'd be worthless to try to plant that unless you can get water to it.
Everything we've talked about so far has all led to this next part, which is stocking density. So the question is, how many cows can a pasture hold, and not only how many can it hold, but for how long as well? What's the duration, and what's the quantity? I'll go over some of this stuff, and it says knowing the amount of dry matter forage a pasture can produce is only part of it, which we've just covered. Amount of the forage required over the grazing season by each animal and the herd as a whole is what determines the stocking density. That should be pretty straightforward, I would hope, but that's why we're doing this, is education, right? So if anybody doesn't know, that's kind of your equation for determining how you can go about being not only, like we said, sustainable, but also productive. The overall goal is to determine the proper combination of land, time, and number of animals to ensure sustained long-term productivity of the pasture, and I'll add the ranch. The optimum number of animals on the pastures makes efficient use of the forage without waste, but still leaves enough forage to allow quick and complete plant recovery. So the plants still have to be able to recover. Obviously, it's like an animal. You got to think of it that way. There's two things: understocking and overstocking. What does understocking do? Well, it's setting the stocking rate too low, and it'll result in a wasted forage and a loss of profit potential. That makes sense. We're leaving things on the table.
Mhm.
Long-term understocking or undergrazing can result in less productive pasture as more woody plants can take up residence. So for us, it would be like sagebrush or yucca could
Yeah.
potentially come in with understocking. But then also overstocking is setting the stocking rate too high for too long, and it'll result in a lowered intake, a lowered animal growth, and diminished profits overall. So essentially, you're throwing money away.
And other kind of weeds and
Right.
invasive species too. So
Yeah.
you got them on both
Well,
sides of that
and that's the
coin.
next thing. It leads to a reduction in desirable plants,
Right.
and an increase in less desirable plants, which is what we just talked about. So the overall, it means livestock must forage for longer periods of time to meet the needs, and the results in a decreased average daily gain. So your average daily gain decreases, which is also not, it's not because of the pastures necessarily, but last year we lost money in terms of weight gain because the heat was so bad and the water was so bad that then the plants weren't as efficient as they could have been, and then therefore the animals were unable to increase their weight like they normally would. So
When
the next,
you had competing species eating those grounds too, like grasshoppers. We had hordes of
right,
grasshoppers, and
right,
grasshoppers are not good this year either. And when you say the water, you're not talking about drinking water. We have good drinking water for them.
mhm,
You're talking about water on the ground. You're talking about
moisture, yeah.
rainfall. Yeah.
So the question really then turns to, uh, how much do the cows eat, or my livestock in our sense, because we're also horses as well.
Yeah.
And then what's the deciding factor? What is my stocking density? So I know we've covered it before, but as a quick review, Dad, what do you say for a cow calf pair? What is the acreage that you estimate for grazing? And then a, let's just say a horse. Well, we won't say a mare and a foal. We'll just say a regular horse. How
Yeah.
much do they need for grazing?
Um, a rule of thumb in this part of the country, really kind of loosely is um, 20 acres per head is a minimum. We're pretty arid here, so I mean, there's some areas that you got like 5 cows per acre in some of the area you're at, or in the Middle Ohio Valley. But about 20 acres is per pair is a probably a just a minimum. So you kind of start basing it off of that, and then good years are fine. We normally don't have. Doesn't seem like we have all that many good years, or we kind of forget about them when the time has passed. But um, having the ability to not overgraze means you're also leaving a little stockpile of grazing where you can, and in case conditions change, now you've got this extra grass that you could go to. Well, if you don't need it, now are you leaving some money on the table or some efficiency? And you are. But I think you're better off doing that, and it's easier on your ground. You're still grazing it, just not grazing it to its 100% maximum, which it does not mean it's all gone. It means where it's good and sustainable. And we can sit here and preach about this, and I can walk out there today and go, oh my God, now I'm overgrazed. What
Yeah.
am I going to do? So it changes that fast. I mean, it's not quite that dramatic. You should be keeping an eye on it, and I am. But I'm starting to see some of these cows. I can see a little weight loss on some, and some cows, their body systems are much better suited to be efficient for themselves. Some are more suited to being more efficient for a calf. So they will draw their own bodies down to feed their calf, and others are, they're just fine. They're fleshy, and they'll keep some weight on and still have a good calf, or they won't produce as much for that calf. So
Well, and
that's all kind of a different, and that's where your culling comes in.
yeah,
What's your
and
efficiency?
I agree with that. That is the next part of the report. It talks less about grazing and more about the grazing animal, like you just
Yeah.
talked about. But it is something I think people need to keep in mind is how efficient is this animal? If this animal needs twice as much to graze to stay and maintain a weight, it's not worth it. And so that's
Right.
where your culling comes in. But if they're more efficient, or we talked to Dr. Jim last year. You were asking about during the preg testing, some questions you had to him, not in terms of being egotistical, but we want to know how are our cows, our herd, how is it performing towards others in the area?
Mhm.
Understanding a lot of other people have black Angus, we have red Angus, so there might be some differences there, but overall, how do they appear to you health wise, size wise, all that? And his explanation was they're doing well so far. You're doing a good job, but keep in mind some of those bigger animals. It's okay if they're too big, because that was one of your concerns. Is you had a couple cows that are just way too big, and they might
Yeah.
not be as profitable in terms of efficiency.
Right.
And some of his explanation that was, due to sizing, they lose less heat, which is crazy enough as he explained it. But
Mhm.
I was like, okay, that makes sense once he did. But it's things like that, understanding the grazing animal too, not just the grazing ground.
Well, he said, our cows they're just a little bit heavy. They're a little bit fat. Well, it's like,
Mhm.
okay, I get it, but and then yeah, he said that's one thing to be critical of, and that's what I'm looking for. It's not about ego and not asking questions. I, you know, sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees, so I'm
Mhm.
constantly, looking to improve or learn something, or, if you think you know it all, you're stupid or you're arrogant, and I don't want to be either one. One you can do something about, the other one maybe not, But so you know, and then he backed right up and said, but with these heavier cows, they winter better. And I was like, especially if you got a bad winter, so
Which we normally
uh
do.
we sometimes will have some stretches of pretty cold weather out there, January, February, but so it's all in what you're going to do. And I do compare our cattle to others based on how they look and how they come out of winter, how the calves look. There's all kinds of factors there that you have to take into account, and you don't know necessarily what somebody else is doing with their cattle.
Right.
Are they growing a herd where they're using smaller bulls on heifers? You're going to have probably tend to have a little bit smaller calves. They're not going to be start out as big bruisers, and then once your herd's established, then you start looking at maybe some bulls with some higher birth weights and some weaning weights. So that all is taken into account. It isn't all just grazing. So efficiency of cows, what you're doing with your program, your genetics, certainly. This hot weather like this, I feel bad for anything that has to stay out in the heat and not be able to have a lot of available shade or a cool place to get. But I really feel sorry for those black cattle. Man, I can't imagine the heat stress that they're
Right.
under compared to our reds. And our reds I mean, they're darker, but they're not like a black. And so that can be an issue. That can be an issue for breeding if it's earlier, if that heat hits earlier in the season. So bodies bodies will tend to survive on their own for themselves, and if they lose a calf because their body system isn't as robust like it should be, that's what'll happen. So you gotta have all the conditions that you can possibly give to them for success, and limit or try to limit the ones that you can. And there's some that you can't do anything about. Heat, grasshoppers are are two of the big ones.
We keep alluding to supplementation, and this is now we're finally getting there. You have to supplement one way, shape, or form all year long. And sometimes you have to supplement more, obviously, typically in the winter for us, uh, or it's going to be later in the fall into the winter. And so that's where a lot of it comes in. You said already you estimate about 30 pounds of hay a day for the cows. But in the report, they say the decision to supplement cattle on pasture is also determined by several other factors. Current and future pasture availability are some of the more
Mhm.
important factors. That's what you're talking about earlier with maybe feeding hay a little bit earlier, because the current pasture availability or its usage is dwindling. So we need to
Mhm.
supplement with hay. So if cattle do not have the access to adequate pasture, then supplementation is needed. That's exactly what we just said. If you know pasture will not be available in time for rotation, you can supplement to preserve the current pasture or delay the move. That also makes sense. You're trying to lengthen some time by squeezing a little bit here, saving a little bit there.
Okay.
And then finally, using body condition scoring with your animals to determine some ideal weights for your cows can help give better insight whether or not to feed in addition to that. But that doesn't, a lot of this stuff is useful, especially when it comes to grazing specifically, but it doesn't talk about what we've discussed before, which is mineral supplementation as well. And that mineral supplementation helps not only with maintaining and gaining weight, but also getting rid of some parasites or getting rid of flies that could potentially hurt their average daily gain that we talked about earlier. So I want to throw to you your insights into supplementing the herd, both through mineral and through hay when it's needed.
That changes. It depends on the time of hay you get too,
Right.
and the hay we just did get purchased, uh, made a deal on getting the hay in here, and that hay has had some lab reports done on part of it. And so I got the reports on it. They did some core samples of some bales, sent it into the lab. And a lot of these feed or supplement type places will do that service for you, either for a small fee or they'll even do it for nothing. Send it off to a lab. You tell them what you got, bring it in, they send it and give you a report later on. Nice service. Of course, they're wanting you to buy their mineral or their lick tubs or whatever it is, and that's fine. That's a good business model. So, um, some years, like last year, I was really worried about having to supplement not just the mineral, because the minerals we just plan on that. We do that regardless of what goes on, any weather, anything like that. We supplement with a good mineral. Some of the minerals have what they call IGR. It's a chemical inside of it, basically, for the want of another word, that helps reduce flies. And so, if they're not fighting flies, they're gaining weight. And so we'll have that out there. But the supplement that I have as a big change or big fluctuation from year to year can be because your grass, your hay has not quite got the protein content you need. And so then we'll feed cake and or pelleted feeds that's got a higher protein in it. And it also has some trace minerals in it for their own use. Now, last year we didn't need to do that, even though the hay was not as good as we've had for the grass hay. The protein content of that hay was up there pretty high. So the quality of the hay being put up from one supplier wasn't great because it was pretty wet areas where it came from. And so the ones that were more local that I was able to get a hold of was very good hay, just didn't have a lot of it. And it was a very high protein. So we supplemented with the pellets almost none, almost zero, which at $300 a ton, that's pretty good savings for us to not have to have that overhead, even though, we overspent or had to spend a lot more than normal on the hay. So having that plan out there, and we do a shotgun approach with our mineral, and that is give them all they want. We try to minimize the intake and moderate it to what they should have, 3 ounces or so per day. But then they get all the salt, and the varieties of salt that they want, and they will kind of take what they want, what they crave. And I've got sulfur blocks, called cobalt blocks, and mixed uh, mineral blocks. Those are the big three that we normally get, and I leave them out there. And at different times of the year, they will hit one of those blocks harder than the other. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to let them have it. Doesn't matter. They're able to be utilized later the next year or throughout the winter. I don't care. Give them what they want so that they can have free choice for it. Um, that makes a big difference, I think, in um, how they are able to utilize and help on some of these minerals to help maintain or gain weight or
Using
development on
mineral
some of these calves.
using mineral too can help with what we talked about before. This was the under grazing and overgrazing, because as we've discussed, cows typically don't want to move away from water. Horses will move horses will move more,
Yeah.
and they'll graze more of the pasture. So the back 40, so to speak, won't get grazed as well by cows, whereas the horses might actually graze it a little bit better. So the other thing too is using mineral not only to help supplement the animals, but also to pull them towards
Yeah,
some of the underutilized
right,
areas so that they can maximize the profit, like we're talking about, or the usage of the land. Because otherwise, they'll just nub everything down to
right,
dirt near water, and then it turns into under overused versus underused at the other part of the
right.
pasture as well.
No, it's a really good point. And that's one of the things that you learn early as a kid, that you're taking that mineral out there to some of these more remote areas where there's decent grass that's not utilized as much, and those cows will travel for it. How far will a little kid go for a candy bar? Kind of the same thing, you know. It's what would you do for a Klondike bar? And these are basically Klondike bars for cows in a big tub, but they do travel for that because they know where it's at. You got to show them where it's at, but then sometimes when it becomes a historical place where they use it, then they'll come to it. But yeah, it pulls them away. Try to pull them away from that water source and into those areas where you don't have quite the grazing. Also helps to stimulate that grass, and that grass gets grazed, it stimulates growth. So it's a win-win where you able to eat the grass, but then it also stimulates better growth later on.
Now, this report talks about different grazing systems, and I'll just kind of spew it out there because I it's been a while since I read this, so we'll see what my take is as we go. It says grazing systems range from continuous grazing of one area over a long period of time to an intensive rotational grazing on small areas for a short period of time. Okay, so it's similar to what we do. Livestock systems that use continuous grazing of a pasture experience both over and under grazing for forages. That's what we just talked about. And then a rotational system provides an opportunity for forage plants to rest so that they may regrow more quickly. I know some people they'll do like intensive, they call it intensive grazing, where they have literally a small plot, maybe an acre or two, and they move the fence physically and it
Mm.
forces the animals to stay within the enclosure, almost like goats. If you're going to take goats or sheep and have them uh, knock down the weeds. That's a lot of what you would do with like the cows. And then finally, the rotational system provides an opportunity to move livestock based on the forage growth and promote better pasture forage utilization and extend
Mm.
the grazing season. So it goes right back to what we were just talking about. It's just much more in labor intensive from what I'm taking from that.
Yeah, and more purposeful, I think. It works better for small areas and almost necessary for smaller areas. But you know what? Big, large ranches as well. Um, your rotation is maybe longer in between rotations because you've got the ground capacity to carry those animals, provided you don't overgraze or
Right.
overstock on that. And I think of that as being, more of a very small plots where they're able to do it with electric fence and literally have 3 4 5 acres and 20 cows, so that their stock to acreage is what we call it upside down. I mean, it's what we're normally running acres per cow, they're running cows per acre. So uh, much more intensive because of the smaller ground. But again, they're trying to maximize it, doing exactly the same thing. They're just watching it a little closer and having to do that sometimes daily, every couple of days. Sometimes they're usually literally doing a 2 or 3 day graze on an area and then move them off and let that recover with some of their sub irrigation that they've got, which is it'd be a nice thing to have.
Yeah, it's expensive though, a lot of overhead.
Yeah.
The last thing that I wanted to cover was having a grazing plan, which also leads into kind of having a grazing map. And all there's a lot of information here. Again, if anybody wants to see it, look up that link below and they'll see it. But the quick ones I want to take away is, design a grazing plan so that you can manage your pasture system that makes sense, understand where your strengths and your weaknesses are in the current system, and then include all the components of the grazing pasture system as a way to manage for improvements and to kind of limit what you might be overgrazing.
Mm.
Then the other part is having a map, and I know for us, it says that you can use mapping software to show boundaries of land. We don't really need that, but I know when we talk about pastures, we know exactly what we're talking about because we're familiar with the place. But if we were to have a guest, we'd have to explain on a map. This is where it's at. This is what we're doing. but it says in the map of your grazing pastures or your grazing land, distinguish land that is owned from that is rented. For us, we call it lease. There's certain management practices that you can apply to your own land that you may not be able to do on the lease, which, yes, absolutely. There's also reasons for taking care of their land maybe a little bit better because there's an incentive to potentially get that land leased to you again. And then determine the number of acres of the different land parcels and label those on the map. Okay, we kind of know what the sizes are, so we're okay there. But then it says mapping can show if there's an additional land available that can be used for grazing, such as cropland that is next to pasture land may be used for better growing forages, and then cropland close to existing pastures is ideal for converting to grazing if the pasture expansion is one of the farm or ranch goals. So yeah, it makes sense for us. It's all about how much can we use this land, how efficient is it, how useful is it, how much is it going to take care of our animals versus so on and so forth. So where is the push to the pole, so to speak? So I want to get Dad's take on having like a grazing plan and like a grazing map.
Yeah, well, that grazing map really is kind of in my head,
Yeah, that's what I
because
was gonna say.
you're riding out through your pastures. They're hitting the water areas, and
Hmm.
we the one pasture we've got. There's 3 square miles of that summer pasture, and there's two major water sources that are live water through there. So those cattle will move between those two for sure. Uh, Depending on the time of year, you get into early summer and the yucca are blooming and they have the yucca pods. Those cows go crazy for that.
It's like
And
candy.
there's, yeah, it's like candy to them. And it's called soapweed for a reason, that yucca. And, they'll be chewing, they'll run to these pods if they're competing with each other. And they're chewing on these pods that ants are crawling all over. So you know how sugary it is. And they are munching these things down in some grazing areas that the grass is good. It just gets a little bit underutilized, but those yucca really pull those cows out there, and it draws them to that grass. And then they do tend to keep coming back to it. So that's kind of nice. But there's another area of the pasture that doesn't have that and is a little bit further away from water. So that's where you have to use some of your mineral, or those cattle will work towards it as they graze down some of the other areas, which is not ideal. You want them to hit them kind of evenly graze all over your pasture at the same time. So, yeah, mapped parts in your head, just from looking at it and knowing where to go. And I don't see really for us to have a reason to do that. We're not trying to improve anything. We're just trying to utilize it. So you just do what you need to do to draw those cattle out there.
Yeah, and like you said, we'll use supplementation to get people get
Yeah,
livestock to move around.
mineral and salt. Yep, big deal.
And then the natural resources, like you said, water, that's a good incentive as well. I've heard of, I think Braden even said it before, there's been studies of them taking water sources and they will purposely take a known water location and move a second one to another location that's underutilized,
Mhm.
so the opposite corner of the pasture, and then make sure that the cows know it's there. And once they know the cows know that it's there, they will shut off the original one, forcing the herd to start to migrate to the next water source. And that's a more Western way of doing it, since the land tends to be more expansive and you can't as intensely rotate the pastures. So they use different resources to pull the animals as well. So I thought, that might be interesting as well to throw in there.
Yeah, and people can utilize some pasture that has no water in it, but when you do that, now you're hauling water,
Right.
and it is time consuming and expensive and a real pain. So you're trying not to do that if you can possibly do it. And I know people, some have no choice. And if you lose a spring, you lose a
Right.
well, guess what? You're hauling water, whether you want to be or not. And I think given their choice, cows are not as picky as horses, but um, still, you want to have a good water source for them. And I think given their choice, they're going to go to whatever the freshest, coolest water is.
Yeah. That is grazing. If anybody's been bored, I'm sorry. But like I said, if anybody's interested in getting into the ranching and farming industry, and they don't think that grazing and land management is important, they're absolutely wrong. We talked about, some of the benefits of grazing. There we go. The importance of, having a plan or a map. We already know those maps, but we don't have to really create those unless it was for an educational purpose. For, once we start getting maybe agritourism going on, we can explain things on a map that might be easier. But, the different grazing systems, is it more labor intensive? Do you use incentives like what we were talking about? What's your quality and productivity? What's your stockage use for, the density of the animals? And then what do we use to supplement the herd? That's all stuff we covered today. But I would say the one thing that I would want somebody to take away from it is the importance of, like you said, the word, and more people, ranchers and farmers, hate the word sustainability, but that's what it is. It's sustainability of the ground so that we can continue the operations as efficiently as possible, and in hopes of making a profit. Because if it's not sustained properly, you kill the very thing that's helping uh manage your operation. So I would say, to us, it's making sure that the environment continues to promote and and grow so that we can use it year after year versus just a one and done deal.
Well, and buzzwords are out there all over the place,
Hmm.
and they have some political connotations to them that like conservation or
Right.
conservationists, and people call themselves that are very extreme in their views. And so it kind of gives a bad name or a stigma to saying that you're a conservationist. And really, in the animal husbandry and agricultural type of setting, we're all conservationists of a sort because we're trying to maintain the ground, get the most out of it,
Hmm.
and still maintain viability over, like you said, a sustainable, indefinite amount of time. So, um, anybody who's out, just trying to trash the ground, they're not going to stay in business very long.
No.
So, you are a conservationist, you are a steward of the ground. And I think, most farmers and ranchers are probably the ultimate at that because your livelihood depends on it in most cases. So, um, you know, always thinking about how to make it better is not anything new. Uh, some of the smartest people I know have been in agriculture, and they're masters at reading what the ground and what the weather has given to them and being able to utilize that to its maximum without harming it later on because they got to be there next year. Their grandkids got to be there next year. You look at it in our case, I'm the fifth, you're the sixth generation on the same place. So, we've not always been profitable. I mean, that's the nature of agriculture too. You know, um, that old joke I say, and many others do. How do you end up with a $2 million ranch? Well, you start with a $20 million
All
ranch.
right.
So it's kind of tough, and it isn't much of a payday some days, but kind of like we do for you. Your payday is we thank you till you're better paid.